Hello, I'm Thibaut Sarlet, the Chief Researcher of the Adrianople Group, and today I have the pleasure of talking to Daniel T. Griswold about free trade related issues. We start our conversation by talking about the US China trade wars before moving on to Brexit. At the end of our conversation, we talk about the case for trade in general. We go over common arguments against free trade, we talk about the role of sanctions, and we discuss how technology is changing the way we understand and perceive trade. Dan Griswold got his bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He got a master's in politics of the world economy from the London School of Economics. Later, he served as press secretary for Congressman Vin Weber of Minnesota. He's written articles for the Wall Street Journal's The LA Times and has appeared on CNN, PBS, CNBC, and many other places. He joined Cato in 1997 and eventually became the Cato Institute's director for the Center of Trade Policy Studies. In 2009, he wrote a book called Mad About Trade: Why Main Street America Should Embrace Globalization. He served as president of the NAFTZ, National Association of Foreign Trade Zones, from 2012 until 2016. Currently, he is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and is the co-director of the Trade and Immigration Program. He recently has published two studies of interest to us: Leading the Way with the US-UK Free Trade Agreement and How the United States Should Respond to China's Intellectual Property Practices with Donald Boudreaux. It is, with no further ado, that I would like to introduce Daniel T. Griswold and thank him for coming on to the show. Can you explain a bit what a trade war is from the perspective of somebody who might be uninitiated in the concept?
A trade war. There isn't a clear definition. It's kind of, you know it when you see it, but I would define it as escalating tariffs on both sides of a dispute that are significant and impose a significant barrier to international trade. And I would say by any definition, the United States and China are in a trade war right now.
So, what kind of dispute initially caused this trade war, and can you give us a bit of background on what this trade war means?
Yes, the United States and most other major trading countries in the world have had running disagreements with China about its policies. I think the main focus is on the treatment of intellectual property, that the Chinese government doesn't do enough to protect intellectual property, and we're talking, patents and computer coding and trade secrets, that sort of thing. And even that the Chinese government itself and the military is actively using cyber tactics to steal data from companies and other governments. China also has a policy that requires foreign investment in certain sectors in China to be joint ventures. The automobile sector's an example right now. And as a condition of those joint ventures, they require that technology be transferred to the Chinese company. And then if the joint venture ends, the Chinese company has the intellectual property. There are other aspects to it. This is a real problem. The cost that it imposes on the United States, I think, is up for some debate. The U.S. International Trade Commission a few years ago looked at it and said U.S. companies were losing about $50 billion a year in sales because of violations of intellectual property. The U.S. has brought cases in the WTO. We've negotiated with the Chinese government. There have been some improvements. China has come a long way in a number of areas over the last 20 or 25 years and since they joined the World Trade Organization. But once the Trump administration came in, these efforts ramped up dramatically. And about 13 months ago, the president became frustrated with the pace of negotiations with China. I won't go into all the details, but the US started escalating, imposing additional duties on imports from China. The Chinese retaliated. Even as we're speaking today, the president is imposing new tariffs on China. China is retaliating against the United States. So the bottom line is right now, both countries have imposed tariffs of anywhere from 10 to 25% on almost all goods traded between the two countries.
So how does this tariff enforced? Is it, for example, that the Federal Trade Commission will just say all goods on China will have to pay a 20% tariff? Or is it more like the US is picking out the type of goods that China is exporting and putting tariffs on those?
Yes, it all goes through really the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and that's headed right now by USTR Robert Lighthizer, who's a longtime critic of trade with China and really sees the world largely as President Trump sees it, as a kind of uh, win-lose trade competition built around trade balances and tariff levels. So uh, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office is using a law called Section 301, and that's from the 1974 Trade Act, and that allows the administration to impose duties on other countries that are treating the United States companies and exports unfairly. That isn't real well defined. The law does require that the U.S. action be proportional to any economic harm caused by the foreign practices. It was a Section 301 initiative by the administration last summer that started this tariff war with China.
In terms of the retaliatory tariffs on the Chinese side, how is China responding to these tariffs, and how will this affect trade in the States?
Well, China is responding on a what you could say is a quid pro quo. So last summer, the U.S. started this all off with tariffs on $50 billion worth of imports from China. And that was roughly equivalent to what the U.S. International Trade Commission had said U.S. companies were losing in sales because of China's intellectual property practices. Uh, but the president then ramped that up by imposing duties on $200 billion worth of imports from China. China retaliated. We import a lot more goods from China than they import from the United States, so we have a lot more imports to target with our duties. Trade is a win-win. Countries that trade with each other, uh, people in both those countries are better off. Well, by the same remorseless economic logic, a trade war is a lose-lose proposition. So President Trump is right. China is being hurt by our tariffs. We're a major export market for China, but the United States is being hurt as well in at least two very big ways. Uh, One, Americans are being hurt as importers and consumers. Despite what the president says, Americans are paying for these tariffs. They are taxes on imports. There have been some major studies by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the New York Fed, and others that have shown that there's almost a 100% pass through to the American public, businesses and consumers that are importing from China of the tariff. So a 25% tariff leads to a proportional increase in prices paid by Americans. So the $30 billion or so that the US Treasury is collecting in extra duties because of these recent tariff actions, that's coming straight out of the pockets of Americans, American consumers, businesses. It's been disrupting supply chains of US companies that are importing parts and other materials from China. So that's a huge impact that is costing the US economy more than $1 billion a month in a drag on the GDP, plus higher prices. And the second way we're losing is our imports to China, our exports to China, China's imports from the United States. They are a major market for US exports. China is the third or fourth largest market for US exports, depending if you look at the European Union as one economy or separate economies. We export or did more than $100 billion worth of goods to China, farm goods, manufactured goods, including automobiles. We export services to China, and U.S. companies sell another $350 billion in China through their foreign-owned affiliates in China. So we're losing sales, and actually, uh, U.S. exports to China have dropped more sharply in this trade war than Chinese imports to the United States. So it's just been a lot of pain all around. Recently, China announced they aren't going to buy any U.S. farm goods for the foreseeable future, and that's been a big loss for U.S. soybean farmers, dairy farmers, um, poultry, and pork producers. So it's just been a big mess. That's why you see the stock market plunging by hundreds of points, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, every time the president tweets about an escalating trade war with China.
So, what type of but there are certain there certainly is an argument to be made that China is using unfair trade practices, is stealing intellectual property, that it is also manipulating its currency. What kind of argument is there that because of this, it is justified for the U.S. to put pressure on China, or else other countries would follow this bad example?
Yeah, well, first, some of those charges are more justified than others. The intellectual property one we covered a moment ago, and that probably has the most validity. China should change its practices. There's no question about it, for the benefit of other countries, but also for the benefit of China. It's got its own intellectual property industry in its country that should be protected to encourage more innovation. Unfair trade, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Since China joined the World Trade Organization, its tariffs on U.S. Uh, goods being exported to China has dropped significantly from an average of about 25% before they joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 to, until recently, about 7%. Now it's gone back up almost to the levels it was before they joined the WTO. By the way, it's lower. It's gone even lower on imports from other countries, so we're losing market share. So I think those charges aren't all that valid. And then the currency manipulation is probably the most specious charge of all. The Chinese, 10 years ago, you had a better case to make that the Chinese were manipulating their currency. But
Yeah, so let's go into a bit more
yes,
depth into the currency manipulation.
absolutely.
What exactly is the charge that China is manipulating its currency, and what would this mean if it was correct?
Yeah. Well, currency manipulation is basically a country through its central bank pushing its currency down in international exchange markets. And that gains at least a short term advantage because their exports become more competitive and more affordable, and it raises the cost of imports. Um, and countries have done that in the past. I would argue it's not a successful policy in the long run for increasing your nation's competitiveness and the prosperity of your people. I mean, just sort of common sense. Do you make your people richer by making their currency worth less in global markets? I would say no. But anyway, um, the U.S. law and the U.S. Treasury have actually defined currency manipulation pretty precisely over the last 3 or 4 years, and that is one-way intervention in currency markets, just as we talked about, a country pushing down its currency, and also a large bilateral surplus with the United States, or in other words, a deficit from the United States, and China definitely meets that, and then an overall current account or overall trade surplus with the rest of the world. Well, China had that at one point, but actually now it's quite small. So China has not been intervening in currency markets, not to push their currency down. They've actually been intervening recently to prop up their currency because of the trade war and other economic factors. Their currency, the market pressure has been down on their currency. So they've not intervened. They don't have a large current account or overall trade surplus with the rest of the world. The only thing is they have a large bilateral deficit with the United States. And so even by our own government's definition, China is not a currency manipulator. The President Trump's own Treasury Department, by law, issues a report twice a year on the currency and trade practices of other countries. They have declined to name China a currency manipulator. Actually, we haven't named China a currency manipulator since the early 1990s, 25 years, more than 25 years ago. And so this latest uh, claim by the Treasury Department that China is manipulating its currency has all the signs of being a political statement and not having any basis in real economic factors.
So, what would be some recommendations? What are some ways that we can step out of this trade war and roll back the clock and repair relations with China and also have free trade for both countries?
That is the most important question of the day. And actually, if your listeners go to our website, mercatus.org, they can find all our research about international trade. But my colleague here at Mercatus, George Mason University professor Don Boudreaux, and I wrote a paper a couple of months ago about on this very subject, about how we should respond as a nation to China's intellectual property practices. And the recommendations we made were not to impose the tariffs. In fact, they were to lift these self-defeating tariffs that the president has imposed against China, which are not leading us to any progress or a deal. Repeal the tariffs, but also take concrete action to challenge China's intellectual property practices in the World Trade Organization. China and the United States and more than 160 other countries belong to the World Trade Organization that has a dispute settlement mechanism. We have taken China to the WTO in the last 2 decades more than 20 times and have prevailed. And China has moved in a market direction in all those cases. We're underutilizing it right now. In fact, the administration is undermining the WTO, which I think is a huge mistake. Another step we can take is to target the actual offenders in China. We've heard a lot about the company Huawei. There are other Chinese companies that are accused of violating intellectual property. There are agencies in China, individuals in China that we know are engaged in intellectual property theft or violation of intellectual property rules. We should go directly after the bad actors. We can impose sanctions. We can impose specific tariffs or bans from doing business against the Chinese actors. We should be doing that rather than these blanket tariffs that are leaving millions of innocent victims and businesses. We can regulate Chinese investment in the United States. Another concern is that China is buying up US technology companies and then transferring the technology back. I think that's exaggerated, but we do have a mechanism. We have an agency here, an interagency board set up called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, and that has the ability to block foreign acquisitions of certain US companies and assets. We should use that. So you put all that, and the final thing is, and this kind of covers everything I said, is that we should work with our allies, the European Union, Canada, Japan, Australia, and others who have the same concerns we do, join together, bringing cases in the WTO against China. We should also consider rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was an important, complicated agreement that the Obama administration negotiated with 11 other countries in the Pacific Rim, including New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Japan. That was a free trade agreement that would have provided an alternative to the Chinese model. Unwisely, President Trump withdrew us from that agreement. One of the first things he did on taking office, that has actually reduced our leverage in the region and enhanced China's leverage. So we should get back into that free trade agreement with our Western allies in that part of the world.
So What effect is the Brexit going to have on U.S. trade?
The United States has an economic interest in Brexit. Great Britain is one of our major trading partners. It's the number, depending on how you measure it, the number five market for U.S. goods exports. It is the number one market for U.S. services exports. In fact, uh, we do more services trade with Britain than we do goods trade. They are the number one foreign investor in the United States. More than 1 million Americans work for British-owned companies in the United States. More than 1 million Brits work for American-owned companies in Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So they're a very important economic and commercial partner. They're, of course, a very important strategic partner. So we have an interest in Brexit. I think that relationship would continue whether they were inside or outside the European Union. So um,
Do you
what
think there
what
might be a flight to safety effect which boosts U.S. trade with Britain if Britain follows through with the Brexit?
I don't know. There's a lot of cross currents. There's some fears that, especially if there's a hard Brexit on October 31st, right, where they leave the European Union without an agreement with Europe about continuing trade relations, that could be quite disruptive of trade, at least in the short run. Um, and that would affect our trade with Britain. So um, I think either way, we're going to continue to have a strong relationship with Great Britain. They are the world's fifth largest economy. We have lots of historic ties and linguistic ties. So, whatever happens in the short run, we're going to continue to have an important relationship with Britain. If they do leave the European Union, the big opportunity is for the United States and Britain to sign a free trade agreement. And both governments, Boris Johnson in Britain, Donald Trump administration here in the US, have signaled their enthusiasm for negotiating a free trade agreement, which could deepen our commercial ties even further.
So, what about the argument that there's a lot of these very problematic EU regulations within the UK, and that it's going to allow the UK to adopt a much more competitive regulatory framework, to have much lower taxes, for example, um, and that this is going to attract a lot of business and increase the trade with the US for that reason, in addition to the flight to safety effect?
Yeah, that's the best case scenario, and I hope that proves to be true. And I think Prime Minister Johnson has said a lot of good things so far. Some people say he's Britain's Donald Trump, but I think there are a lot of stark differences. Um, they both have kind of funky hairstyles and seem to like each other. But some of the differences are Boris Johnson is strongly pro trade. He believes in free trade. He's also pro immigration, which is very interesting. Um, and so I think if the Conservatives under Boris Johnson's leadership continue to govern Britain, I think you'll see them move in that direction. More deregulation, lower taxes. Um, the European Union has a common tariff area, right? A customs union, and they're generally low tariff in terms of trade, but they have their highest duties tend to be on agricultural products. They do have a 10% duty on imported automobiles. And my hope is that a Britain outside the European Union will, I'd like to see them go to zero tariffs on virtually everything. But there's a great hope and expectation that they will get rid of those high tariffs. And if we have a trade agreement with them, like our trade agreements that we have with 20 other countries, we can achieve virtually zero tariffs on all goods between the countries.
So, what would be a really bad worst case scenario for Brexit looks like? Assume that it's the most destabilizing, the most chaotic, and that the governments have very poor responses to it in the US, EU, and the UK. What would that scenario look like?
Yeah, here's the worst case scenario, and unfortunately, I wouldn't say it's probable, but it's certainly plausible, and that is the hard Brexit proves to be very disruptive. Um, it shakes business confidence in Britain. The other thing hanging over Britain is the Labour Party leadership. The opposition leader is a member of parliament named Jeremy Corbyn, and he is hard left. He's to the left of Bernie Sanders. And if his government, if his party were to take over the government of Britain, you wouldn't see taxes go down. I think you'd see them go up. You'd see regulation increase, maybe beyond what the European Union would do. And so, Britain being asserting its sovereignty and taking back control could be a two-edged sword, and that is it could move in the pro-market direction, but also under a Labor government under Jeremy Corbyn, it could move towards more regulation, higher taxes, nationalizing industry, and in my view, being a pro-market person, I think that could discourage investment and economic growth in Britain, and they would be a less robust trading and commercial partner to the United States under those conditions. And Jeremy Corbyn may not want to negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States. He doesn't like the United States that much, according to his public pronouncements. So there's just a lot of uncertainty surrounding Brexit right now.
So we've been talking a lot about specific instances of trade-related events, the US-China trade wars, the Brexit. Let's talk a bit about trade in the abstract. Um, what is the case for free trade?
Well, the most, I think, the most enduring case for free trade is that it allows individuals and nations to prosper, to be more productive. Just think of trade on a personal level. You and I are better off because we can specialize in what we do best and trade for things like food and clothing and housing. Think how poor we would be as individuals if we had to make all our own clothes and shoes, grow our own food, build our own homes. That's what Adam Smith said when he said, what is prudent for a household can scarce be folly in a kingdom. So nations are better off when they specialize and do what they're best in and then trading for the rest. Free trade has proven to be a superior policy over the decade and the centuries. You just look around the world, nations that are more open to trade and international investment have higher standards of living, and their people are just freer all around. So free trade is a robust policy. The U.S., in a bipartisan fashion, has embraced freer trade since World War II. We had a very negative experience in the Great Depression with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and retaliation from other countries. And we've been much better off embracing free trade. We're better off economically, and then nations that trade with each other tend tend to get along better. It's an instrument of foreign policy and peace. And I think the more we pursue free trade in the United States, the better off we are day to day economically. But I think we also cultivate a more hospitable and peaceful world.
So I'd like to go over a few objections to common sort of free trade arguments. And the first is what of the argument that there's certain industries like the US domestic steel industry, which need to be protected or else they'll be in go into foreign hands and disappear from the United States.
Yeah, that that is an argument that you could kind of make in a textbook, but it almost never works in real life. National security is, to
And
quote,
food production, for example.
yes, it's kind of the last. The national security argument is the last refuge of protectionists when their economic arguments don't work. Look, our security is rooted not in protecting domestic industries, but in being the most productive country we can, offering our goods and services to the rest of the world and trading with them. But let's just take the two examples you brought up. Steel. Before the president imposed his tariffs last year, we have had and continue to have a viable steel industry. We were producing 80 million tons of steel a year. It was providing most of the steel we consume here in the United States. The U.S. military consumes a very small amount of steel relative to what we produce. They didn't need a protected domestic steel industry. All the tariffs have done is, one, invite retaliation from other countries, which has been bad, but it's driven up the domestic price of steel. And for every steel worker, there are 30 workers in the United States in industries that use steel. Their jobs are made less secure. I'm talking automobiles, construction, um, appliances, all those industries. So uh, if you want to promote an industry, you can do things. You can have direct subsidies. That's less damaging. You can have the government through procurement favor domestic industries, but don't raise tariffs against the rest of the world. Same with agriculture. We would be foolish to raise barriers to agriculture. We are a fantastically productive agricultural country. We export 1 out of 5 acres in this country of production. That adds to our security. And finally, the things we import, most of the stuff we import that are of any arguable strategic benefit, we tend to import from our allies, Canada, European Union, Japan. They're not a national security. How absurd was it to impose steel duties against imports from Canada, as though sourcing steel from Canada was some threat to our national security? So I would just urge your listeners to be very skeptical when anybody uses national security to justify tariffs that ultimately are just to benefit a domestic special interest.
So, what about the argument that, for example, in the case of China, China's intellectual property thefts in the US um, sort of justifies some sort of a reduction of trade with the country of China, um, maybe from a national security perspective, maybe from a perspective of showing other countries. Um, like that would be an example where having all of these Chinese nationals for long periods of time in US companies and all of this commercial access may have made American markets more vulnerable.
Well, I think the answer to that is let's go after the problems thinking strategically, and not these blanket tariffs, which have not achieved the objective. We haven't improved China's behavior one bit with this tariff war. If anything, we've strengthened and hardened the hardliners in Beijing against the United States. And if anything, we've probably created some sympathy for China around the world. It's been a self-defeating policy. I think we should use the instruments we talked about earlier in our conversation, using existing U.S. law to oversee and potentially block Chinese investments in strategic U.S. companies or industries. We can monitor individuals here in the United States from China. We have 600,000 Chinese students here in the United States. To label them spies, I think, is just irresponsible and unfair to them. Um, Chinese nationals and immigrants here in the United States have contributed significantly to our economy and our technological base. And we can go after bad actors in China that are practicing cyber theft and things like that. So China is not an ally like Japan or Australia or Canada. They're clearly a rival. So we need to go in with our guard up, with our antenna up. But we can also trade in a mutually beneficial way with them, which we have with China for three or decades or more since they came out of their isolation. And I think we should continue that while monitoring specific practices.
So I want to shift gears a bit and go into the question of international trade sanctions against certain countries like Iran, and says certain people want to do against other countries, that are more controversial, like Israel. Um, the case of North Korea seems to show that sanctions, the effectiveness of sanctions, is very debatable and uncertain. Um, would you make the case that we should just have international trade with all countries and repeal sanctions?
As much of a free trader as I am, I wouldn't go that far. And this is where you're really getting out of the realm of trade as an economic issue, and you're
And
getting
it's more
more
trade
into
as a geopolitical instrument.
right, or even just foreign policy. Iran, Iran is an enemy of the United States, their government, by any measure. North Korea is a hostile foreign power,
But
and we
But
need
one could
to.
make this case that the way that you beat a North Korea or an Iran in the long term is by having open trade and, for example, allowing Iran to have access to US consumer goods and creating sort of a demand for a free market, much more liberal sort of regime.
Yes, and I wouldn't dismiss that argumentation. The only thing I'm just raising a caveat, a qualification, and that is if a foreign government is openly hostile to the United States and is actively working against our interests, there is an argument for, well, certainly on like nuclear materials and missile technology. Uh, we, we shouldn't allow people to sell those to these hostile regimes where that technology can then be turned against us and our allies. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but I just think there's a case where it really spills over in a significant way into the foreign policy realm. I will say sanctions have been overused in this country. They don't tend to be effective. Certainly, for example, against Cuba. We've had an embargo against Cuba for over half a century, and it has not achieved what our government intended it to achieve. There hasn't been a fundamental change in their government there. It hasn't affected their behavior. So I'd like to see us largely lift the embargo with Cuba. So I'll just say it's a country by country case. I think we have to be careful of sweeping statements one way or the other.
Right, right. There's an interesting example, a sort of a case study of this. I have two good examples about how China's Belt and Road has sort of taken advantage of ill-placed U.S. sanctions and Western sanctions. The first is the case of Iran, where Iran has a oversupply of highly educated labor. So the Chinese have recently funded a high-speed railroad that goes straight to Tehran.
Yeah.
Um, and they're going to be able to take advantage of all of these highly educated yet fairly cheap, high skilled Iranian laborers in their western province. And another example of this was that after the 2014-2015 Crimean crisis, the European Union imposed sanctions on Russia to buy less oil from Russia, hoping to cripple the government revenues. But the Chinese government started building oil pipelines and increasing the oil purchases from Russia in the following years. And every year that this goes on, the U.S. sanctions on Iran and Russia become less effective, and they've sort of created an opportunity for China. Um, have you heard anything about this, or do you have any similar examples that you know of sanctions having this sort of unusual effect?
Yeah, I'm not an expert. I know a little bit about the Belt and Road Initiative, but it isn't squarely in my area.
All
I
right.
would say if China and another government want to make arrangements for China to build infrastructure in that country, that's really between them. I mean, uh, we can have a discussion with our allies about whether it's prudent or not. There is some pushback on the Belt and Road, isn't there? Countries are seeing, and it's quite plausible that China is taking advantage of them and saddling them with a lot of debt. So I think it's just really between China and these other countries. We need to do what's in our interest. And I think it's in our America's interest to keep our trade barriers as low as possible, to welcome foreign investment in the United States, while being sensitive to issues that directly affect our national security.
So, to change gear a bit, there's been a lot of changes of the nature of international trade over the last few decades. There's been the rise of companies like Amazon with home shipping. There's
Yes.
been technologies like Bitcoin and the blockchain, which have created sort of entirely virtual currencies. And now there's a whole wide variety of transactions which could be considered international trade, but where no physical products are exchanged. For example, when I send money to somebody else to buy a song, a digital download, or something like that.
Yes.
Um, how is the changing nature of technology uh, changing the way that international trade should be conceived of by policymakers?
Yeah, that's a really big cosmic kind of question. And of course, technology and trade have been intertwined for centuries, haven't they? Ship technology, steamships, the containerization revolution of the 50s and the 60s. The internet has had a profound effect on international trade. Um, for example, Richard Baldwin, in his book, The Great Convergence, uh, points out that with the rise of the internet, it's been much more possible and plausible for companies to spread their supply chains around the world and monitor the production facilities in less developed countries in a way it wasn't before. And then, of course, most recently, as you just mentioned, things like blockchain, artificial intelligence, digital trade. These are all important. I would say beneficial to humankind. Um, Digital trade, for example, the US is very competitive in these areas. That's why newer trade agreements, the Trans Pacific Partnership being one of them, have digital trade chapters that say no taxes or no barriers on digital trade. Um, Servers, where servers are located. It's more and more important for the United States to try to make it an international norm that governments can't dictate that servers be located in those countries. And that's important, and that's contained in most trade agreements. So technology and trade work together, and I would say generally in a beneficial way for mankind. Even though some people and some companies lose out from the competition, uh, generally we're all left better off.
So, I think with that positive note, we're going to end today's episode. So, I would like to thank you very much for coming on to the Geoeconomics podcast.
It's
With
been a
that, I
pleasure.
have one last question. And you're currently working at the Mercatus Center. Is there anything that you'd like to promote? Any projects that you're working on that you would like to tell our audience about?
Uh, yes, I, I've authored a paper for Mercatus on the benefits of a U.S. United Kingdom free trade agreement, and they're welcome to look that up on our website. That's going to be very much in the news in coming months with Brexit approaching. And then the paper I mentioned on how the United States should respond to Chinese intellectual property practices. I think those two recent research efforts on my part are the most relevant to our conversation today.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Great, it's been a pleasure.
I would like to thank Daniel Griswold a lot for coming on to the Geoeconomics podcast. The Geoeconomics podcast is brought to you by the Adrianople Group. The Adrianople Group is a business intelligence and consulting firm that specializes in economic zones and free trade zones. We provide a wide variety of services such as due diligence, investment assistance, marketing services, and cybersecurity. For more information, please visit adrianoplegroup.com.